Okay. Definition. Equal protection. Equal protection. ¿Cuál es la definición de la protección a la igualdad? The government is treating people differently. The government is treating people differently. The government is treating people differently. El gobierno está tratando a personas en forma diferente. What is strict scrutiny? What is strict scrutiny? Applies to race, alienage, and national origin. Race, alienage, national origin. The government has the burden, and it's necessary to achieve a compelling interest. It's necessary to achieve a compelling interest. Escrutinio estricto aplica a la raza, a la alienación, al origen nacional. El gobierno tiene la carga de la prueba de demostrar que cierta ley que debe pasarse es necesaria para alcanzar un interés importante, un interés primordial, compelling interest. So 3 elements of strict scrutiny. The protected classes are race, alienage, and national origin. RAN, race, alienage, national origin. Government has the burden of proof, and if the government passes a law, the government must prove that the law is necessary to achieve a compelling interest. Intermediate scrutiny. Intermediate scrutiny applies to gender, illegitimate birth. Applies to gender, illegitimate birth. Applies to gender and illegitimate birth. The government has the burden. The government has the burden. And if the government passes a law, the government has the burden to prove that the law is substantially related to an important interest. The law is substantially related to an important interest. The law is substantially related to an important interest. El escrutinio intermediario o intermedio aplica a género y a nacimiento ilegítimo o hijos ilegítimos. El gobierno tiene la carga de la prueba de demostrar que la ley que aprueba está sustancialmente relacionada a un interés importante. Está sustancialmente relacionada a un interés importante. Rational basis. Rational scrutiny. Rational basis. It applies to everyone else. So if it's not race, alienage, national origin, gender, or illegitimate birth, applies to everyone else. The plaintiff has the burden. The plaintiff has the burden, and the law that passes must be rationally related to a legitimate interest. The law must be rationally related to a legitimate interest. For rational basis or rational scrutiny, it applies to everyone else. No suspected or semi-suspected class or quasi-protected class. The plaintiff has the burden to prove, and the law must be rationally related to a legitimate interest. En el escrutinio racional, en la base racional, aplica a todos los demás grupos que no están dentro de una clasificación. El demandante tiene la carga de la prueba y tiene que estar racionalmente relacionada a un interés legítimo. Tiene que estar racionalmente relacionada a un interés legítimo. The definition of substantive due process. The definition of substantive due process. La definición del debido proceso sustantivo. The government is regulating a right for all people. The government is regulating a right for all people. The government is regulating a right for all people. El gobierno está regulando un derecho para toda la gente. Examples are all citizens must, all citizens shall not. If you want to do X, all people must do Y. En el debido proceso sustantivo, el gobierno está regulando un derecho para toda la gente, para toda la gente. Por ejemplo, todos los ciudadanos deben, o todos los ciudadanos no deben, por ejemplo, son frases. What are the levels of scrutiny for substantive due process? Substantive due process has 2 levels of scrutiny, not 3, like equal protection has 2, fundamental rights and non-fundamental rights. Fundamental rights and non-fundamental rights. For fundamental rights, there is strict scrutiny. For fundamental rights, there is strict scrutiny. Number 2, for non-fundamental rights, there is a rational basis. So there is 2 levels of scrutiny, strict scrutiny and rational basis. Hay 2 niveles de escrutinio para el debido proceso sustantivo, los derechos fundamentales y los derechos no fundamentales. Para los derechos fundamentales es el escrutinio estricto y para los derechos no fundamentales es un escrutinio racional, en la base racional. Fundamental rights. Fundamental rights. Derechos fundamentales, ¿cuáles son? So there are 3 fundamental rights. I like to summarize it as beef in that different order. Vote, interstate travel, free speech. Vote, interstate travel, free speech. Vote, interstate travel, free speech. Hay 3 derechos fundamentales para el derecho sustantivo del debido proceso. De voto, todo lo relacionado al voto, la libertad de expresión y al viaje interestatal, travel. Hay una L ahí, there's a missing L. What are privacy rights? Privacy rights. So that would be camper. But now we have one, the second one has been eliminated. So camper triggers strict scrutiny. Privacy rights. What are privacy rights? There's 5 essential ones. Camper. So contraception, abortion is no longer into the classification. Contraception, marriage, procreation, education, and number 6 will be raise a family, the right to raise a family. So contraception, marriage, procreation, education, and the right to raise a family. The definition of, los derechos privados, Camper llama al escrutinio estricto y serían 5. La contracepción o los derechos de anticonceptivos, ¿sí? El matrimonio, la procreación, la educación y el derecho de procrear una familia, procrear hijos. Definition, procedural due process. Definition, procedural due process. La definición del derecho procesal, del debido proceso, ¿sí? Del debido proceso procesal. Property rights, property rights. We have 3 property rights. Governmental jobs, licenses, public benefits. Governmental jobs, licenses, public benefits. Governmental jobs, licenses, public benefits. Entonces hay 3 derechos de propiedad en el derecho procesal del debido proceso. Cuando hay empleos con el gobierno, empleos gubernamentales, cuando hay cierto tipo de licencias y cuando hay beneficios públicos. Governmental jobs, licenses, public benefits. Levels of scrutiny for procedural due process. Levels of scrutiny for procedural due process. No levels of scrutiny. They do need notice and a hearing. There is no levels of scrutiny for procedural due process. They do need notice and a hearing. They do need notice and a hearing. There is no levels of scrutiny. En los niveles del escrutinio, del debido proceso procesal, no hay niveles de escrutinio y se necesita una noticia y una audiencia. equal protection and due process. Equal protection and due process. Protección de igualdad y el debido proceso. Protección de igualdad y el debido proceso. Equal protection and due process. So for federal law is the Fifth Amendment. For federal law is the Fifth Amendment. For state law is the 14th Amendment. For state law is the 14th Amendment. En el debido proceso y la protección de la igualdad, en el derecho federal es la quinta enmienda y en el derecho estatal es la enmienda 14. La 14 enmienda por lo estatal, la quinta enmienda por lo federal. 13th versus 15th Amendment. 13th versus 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment bans slavery. The 13th Amendment bans slavery. Private individuals cannot racially discriminate. The 13th Amendment bans slavery, and private individuals cannot racially discriminate. The 13th Amendment bans slavery, and private individuals cannot racially discriminate. The 13th Amendment bans slavery, private individuals cannot racially discriminate. And the 15th Amendment, voting and racial discrimination. The 15th Amendment contains voting and racial discrimination. Voting and racial discrimination. Cuando comparamos la enmienda 13 y la 15, la enmienda 13 prohíbe el esclavismo y prohíbe que individuos privados no discriminen en forma racial, no sean racistas, personas individuales, no el gobierno. La enmienda 13 prohíbe el esclavismo, prohíbe acciones de individuos privados, no el gobierno. Y la enmienda 15 contiene lo que es el voto y la discriminación racial, afuera de lo que son individuos privados. Taking clause rule. What is the taking clause? So the rule for taking clause. Taking clause. Taking clause. The rule for the taking clause. The rule is that, number one, government taking private property. Number two, for public use. Three, with just compensation. Taking clause, government taking private property for public use with just compensation. The government is taking private property for public use with just compensation. Number one, government taking private property. Number two, for public use. Number three, with just compensation. Entonces, en la expropiación, la regla es que, número uno, el gobierno esté tomando propiedad privada. Número dos, para el bien común, para el uso público. Número tres, a cambio de una indemnización, ¿sí? A cambio de un beneficio económico, un pago. Definition of public use. The definition for public use, any overall public benefit. What is public use for the takings clause? Any overall public benefit. ¿Cuál es la definición del uso público? Cualquier beneficio público. Cualquier beneficio público en general. So it's very broad, es bastante amplio. Inverse condemnation. Inverse condemnation. Inverse condemnation denies you the economic benefit of the land. Denies you the economic benefit of the land. Inverse condemnation denies you the economic benefit of the land. And the value left is worth nothing. So inverse condemnation denies you the economic benefit of the land. Denies you the economic benefit of the land. The value left is worth nothing. The value left is worth nothing. The value left is worth nothing. Inverse condemnation niega el beneficio económico de la tierra, ¿sí? Y el valor que deja es básicamente nada. Ya no vale nada con la condenación inversa. Religion. Definition establishment clause. Definition of the establishment clause. Religion. Definition of the establishment clause. The government cannot pass a law that formally sponsors or establishes a religion. The government cannot pass a law that formally sponsors or establishes a religion. The government cannot pass a law that formally sponsors or establishes a religion. So the Establishment Clause, the government cannot pass a law that formally sponsors or establishes a religion. La cláusula del establecimiento, el gobierno no puede pasar una ley que formalmente patrocine o establezca una religión. The test of the Establishment Clause, history and tradition. History and tradition, number one, and neutrality. History and tradition and neutrality. The test of the Establishment Clause, history and tradition and neutrality. That's the test for the Establishment Clause. Definition of the Free Exercise Clause. Government must remain neutral on practice of religion. Government must remain neutral on the practice of religion. La definición del libre ejercicio de la cláusula, el gobierno debe permanecer neutro en la práctica de una religión. A law neutral to religion will be constitutional even if the effect prohibits religion, Expresión. Voz. Content-based regulation for speech. Content-based regulation for speech. The government stops the message and triggers strict scrutiny. The content-based regulation of speech has two elements. The government has two elements. The government stops the message and triggers strict scrutiny. The government stops the message and it triggers strict scrutiny in content-based regulation. The government stops the message and triggers strict scrutiny. So as long as the government stops a message, it will trigger strict scrutiny. Constitutionality. Content-neutral regulation. Constitutionality of content-neutral regulation. It furthers significant governmental interest, leaves open alternative means of communication, and it's a form of intermediate scrutiny. Content-neutral regulation furthers significant government interest, leaves open alternative means of communication, and it's a form of intermediate scrutiny. Furthers significant governmental interest, leaves open alternative means of communication, and it's a form of intermediate scrutiny. Public forum, streets and parks, must further significant government interest, leave open alternative means of communication. Ok, vamos a regresar uno más. Entonces, en la constitucionalidad de la regulación de contenido neutral, avanza para un interés gubernamental significante y deja abiertos otros medios alternativos de comunicación y es una forma de escrutinio intermedio. Public forum, streets and parks must further significant government interest and leaves open alternative means of communication. So a public forum includes streets and parks and must further significant government interest, and it leaves open alternative means of communication. So in a public forum, streets and parks, it must further significant government interest, and it leaves open alternative means of communication. Streets and parks must further significant government interest, and it leaves open alternative means of communication. Entonces en el public forum son parques y calles, debe mostrar que avanza un interés del gobierno significante y tiene que dejar canales abiertos alternativos de comunicación. Non-public forum. Billboards, signs, buses, reasonably related to a legitimate government interest. Billboards, signs, and buses, reasonably related to a legitimate government interest. Reasonably related to a legitimate government interest. Entonces, cuando es un foro no público, hay letreros, señales, buses, y tiene que estar razonable para que en una forma relacionada a un interés legítimo de gobierno. Unprotected speech. Discurso no protegido. Obscenity. La obscenidad. A prurient interest in sex by objective local community standards. A prurient interest in sex by objective local community standards. Number one, a prurient interest in sex by objective local community standards. Number two, it depicts sex in a patently offensive manner. Number two, it depicts sex in a patently offensive manner. Number three, lacks any serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Lacks any serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. A prurient interest in sex by objective local community standards, one. Number two, depicts sex in a patently offensive manner. Number three, lacks any serious literary, artistic, and political, or scientific value. La obscenidad es un interés puro en sexo, se mide mediante estándares objetivos locales de una comunidad y pone al sexo en una forma ofensiva, ¿sí? Y no tiene ningún sentido serio en literatura, en arte, en política o ningún valor científico. Clear and present danger. Clear and present danger. Clear and present danger. Peligro presente y claro. Speech incites imminent violent action. Speech incites imminent violent action and is likely to produce violence. The speech incites imminent violent action and is likely to produce violence. Clear and present danger. Speech incites imminent violent action and is likely to produce violence. El peligro presente y claro, el discurso incita violencia eminente y es bastante probable que produzca violencia. Fighting words, harsh language, likely to incite an average person to commit violence. Fighting words, it's a harsh language, likely to incite an average person to commit violence. Fighting words, is a harsh language likely to incite an average person to commit violence. Palabras de pelea es un lenguaje fuerte, bastante seguro que incite a una persona promedio de que cometa violencia. Fighting words based on the individual versus clear and present danger based on the group. So the fighting words is based on the individual versus the clear and present danger, which is based on the group. Las palabras de pelea están basadas en el individuo, el peligro claro y presente está basado en el grupo. Commercial speech. Commercial speech. Business-related speech, reasonable fit to a substantial interest, and is narrowly tailored. Commercial speech is a business-related speech, reasonably fit to a substantial interest, and is narrowly tailored. Business-related speech, number one. Number two, reasonable fit to a substantial interest. And number three is narrowly tailored. Bien. El discurso comercial está relacionado a un negocio, número uno. Número dos, está relacionado a un interés sustancial. Y número tres, está enfocado en una forma específica. Narrow, corta, pequeña. False and misleading advertisement. False and misleading advertisement. Speech that provides false and misleading information. Speech that provides false or misleading information and is not protected. Speech that provides false or misleading information is not protected. Anuncios que sean falsos o que redirijan la verdad en una forma no apropiada, ¿sí? Es un discurso que provee información falsa o que desinforme, ¿sí? Y no está protegido ese tipo de discurso. Prior restraint. Prior restraint. Restricción previa. Stop speech before it is published, such as injunctions, gag orders. Stop speech before it is published, injunctions, gag orders. Una restricción previa detiene el discurso antes que sea publicado como un tipo de restricción. ¿Sí? Unfettered discretion. A government official cannot choose or allow one form of speech over another. Unfettered discretion. A government official cannot choose or allow one form of speech over another. The government official cannot choose or allow one form of speech over another. Discreción. ¿Sí? Un gobierno oficial no puede escoger o dejar una forma de discurso sobre otra. Overbroad and vague speech, discurso vago o largo. El estatuto dice que no puede ser muy largo, muy general o muy vago. Las palabras claves uno o dos. The overbroad or vague speech. The statute cannot be too broad or too vague. Keywords any or all. The statute cannot be too broad or too vague. Keywords any or all. Bill of attainder. Bill of attainder cannot expressly punish an individual or name group of people. Cannot expressly punish an individual or a named group of people. It applies to both federal and state government. It applies to both federal and state government. A bill of attainder cannot expressly punish an individual or named group of people. Applies to both federal and state government. Bill of attainder cannot expressly punish an individual or named group of people and applies to both federal and state government. La ley del attainder no puede en forma expresa castigar a un individuo o a un grupo de personas específico y aplica al gobierno federal y estatal. Ex post facto laws. Ex post facto laws. Law that retroactively makes action illegal. Law that retroactively makes action illegal. Applies to both federal and state government. Applies to both federal and state government. Es una ley que es retroactiva. No puede haber irretroactividad. Está prohibida la... Bueno, debe ser irretroactiva, ¿sí? No puede ser retroactiva para castigar un hecho punible que no era punible y volverlo punible, y aplica al gobierno federal y estatal. Y eso es todo. Ojalá les haya gustado. Y bien, este es un audio que estoy utilizando para el examen de la barra de Estados Unidos, y yo creo que les va a ser muy útil si quieren profundizar su inglés, si quieren conocer más del derecho anglosajón, o de repente están estudiando para el examen de Estados Unidos también. Estas leyes son muy importantes, son las básicas. Black Letter Law, la ley más importante, y es importante saberse la memoria. Gracias.